Hello everyone, thanks for coming to my talk. Today I'm going to be talking about sex selection and adaptive preferences. This is some work that is coming out on a postdoc that I'm doing as a part of the Son-Preference in the UK project at the University of Reading, funded by the ERSC. Together with Sylvie de Burke, Agamani Ganguly-Mitra, and Narayan Approach, we suggest that thinking about preferences for the particular sex of one's child are usefully thought of through the lens of adaptive preferences, though this causes some complications for our adaptive preference framework, as we shall see. Okay, so the plan is to first off introduce the context for this talk, thinking first about sex selection in the UK and some of the literature on the ethics of sex selection. Then we'll turn to the leading account of adaptive preferences in the literature, Shreen Kada's account. And then we'll turn to an alternative, a Narayan-inspired account of adaptive preferences, which we think better captures what's going on. Okay, so sex selection in the United Kingdom. Sex selection is the act of choosing what the sex of one's child, whether via sperm sorting, IVF, selective abortion, or other methods. Now in the UK, this practice peaked in around 2005 to 2006 before tailing off, but it definitely still does go on. Now, there are two salient motivations for sex selection in the United Kingdom. First off, boy preference or son preference, and this is where a boy is seen as a necessity, and so is preferred and selected for, especially in cases where a family already has one or two girls. Then there's family balancing sex selection, which is driven by the desire for a perfect family that features one child of so-called both genders, right? So if you've got a boy, you want a girl. If you've got a girl, you want a boy. Now, one might ask, what's so troubling about this? People have rights to bodily autonomy. What's so bad about sex selection? Well, a lot of the critiques have come from feminist theorists, and for the most part, they're concerned with the reproduction of particular kinds of troubling ideology. Okay, so what's troubling about boy preference sex selection? People have argued, well, the patriarchal ideology that boys are valued more than girls is expressed and reproduced, right? If you're seeing boys as a necessity, whereas girls are not, well, you're expressing the value that boys are more valuable than girls. In family balancing sex selection, we see the ideology of the ideal family being perpetuated, marginalizing other forms of care network, and entrenching the unequal labor relations in the heart of a traditional family. And finally, there's a kind of broader argument which says, look, in all types of sex selection, there's a kind of gender essentialism that's going on here. The thought that a child of a particular sex will necessarily fit into a particular gender role, and so in selecting for sex, you're going to be able to select for gender. And that's a really troubling thought, and something that many feminists have argued is something that should be rejected. Okay. The key insight I think that I take from these sorts of arguments, though, is it looks like sex selection reproduces a bunch of practices that oppress women, whether that's the unequal labor relationships in the heart of the family, gender essentialism, or simply the view that boys are worth more than girls. These ideologies reproduce a bunch of practices which oppress women. So if one buys these sorts of arguments, you're struck with a sort of puzzle, right? Despite the fact that these practices oppress women, women still form preferences for sex selection and engage in sex selective practices. So what's going on here? Now, the task of explaining what's going on in these sorts of cases, not sex selection in particular, but these sorts of cases of people acting in ways which seem to not be in their interests, is generally handed off in the philosophical literature to the adaptive preference framework. And the basic idea here is that we adapt our preferences to the circumstances that we find ourselves in. Now, sometimes these adaptations mean that we prefer things that aren't in our interests, and this is especially the case, it's claimed at least, in cases where we're oppressed or in other circumstances that are not conducive to our flourishing. The preeminent account of adaptive preferences currently in the literature, at least as far as I can tell, comes from Shreen Kada. And Kada begins from the perspective of a development practitioner or an NGO or some other organization asking whether they should intervene on some group. Okay. Now, Kada needs a kind of a definition of adaptive preferences to ask, okay, so when does someone have an adaptive preference such that I can intervene to change that preference? Well, she says adaptive preferences are as follows. They are: 1, preferences inconsistent with a person's basic flourishing; 2, that are formed under conditions non-conducive to her basic flourishing; and 3, that we do not think a person would have formed under conditions conducive to a person's basic flourishing. What's basic flourishing? Well, the Kada involves things like adequate nutrition, good health, control over one's political environment, education, and so on. Things are a little bit more complicated than that, but I don't have time to go into that today. However, Carter doesn't think that this definition alone is enough. She suggests that we also need some sort of prospective definition or a diagnostic tool. And this will allow a development practitioner to figure out whether someone has an adaptive preference that meets the definition that she just gave. So this is her diagnostic tool. Representatives of a public institution can reasonably suspect a preference of adaptiveness if that preference is inconsistent with basic flourishing and it was formed under conditions not conducive to that person's flourishing, and we believe it's possible for the person to change that preference into a preference more conducive with flourishing and endorse that change. Now, if these conditions are met, Carter suggests that a deliberative intervention is warranted. So, what's Carter's account of sex selection going to be? Well, I think that Carter can offer something like the following account. The UK is still a patriarchal society that subjects women to sexual violence and harassment. Women in the UK live in a society that is non-conducive to their flourishing, and due to such conditions, form preferences for sex selection. So we've got preferences which are inconsistent with flourishing, thus conditions 1 and 1p of Carter's various parts of her account are met, and they're formed under conditions not conducive to flourishing. So condition 2 and 2p are met for Carter's account. However, this is where things get a little bit interesting. Note that 1 and 1p are basically identical. Similarly, 2 and 2p are almost identical. However, the definition in the diagnostic tool really begin to diverge when it comes to condition 3 and 3p. Okay. So 3 is that we do not think a person would have formed that preference under conditions conducive to basic flourishing. Right? That's the definition. That's a part of the definition of what it is to be an adaptive preference. Meanwhile, the diagnostic tool tells us that we can reasonably suspect something of being an adaptive preference if we believe it's possible for the person to change the preference into a preference more consistent with flourishing and endorse the change. So here's a question. Why, if 3p is supposed to be a part of the diagnostic tool for identifying adaptive preferences, is it so different to 3, which is the relevant part of how adaptive preferences are defined? So note that 3 is backwards looking. It poses a counterfactual about the conditions under which a preference was formed. It's about whether a person would have formed that preference under conditions that were more conducive to her flourishing. Meanwhile, 3p is forwards looking. It's determined by the possibility of future changes in preference, right? It's about whether the person could change that preference into a preference more consistent with flourishing and endorse that change. So importantly, these two conditions are going to pick out very different cases. So here's an example. This is a character I've invented called Stubborn Ellen. She formed a preference for having a boy under conditions which weren't conducive to her flourishing. Moreover, she's really stubborn, so won't change that preference under any circumstance. Now, importantly, she wouldn't have formed that preference in the first place if her initial conditions had been better suited to her flourishing. So the thing to note about Ellen is that she's going to meet conditions 1 to 3. She's going to meet the definition of adaptive preferences on Cater's account. But she's not going to meet conditions 1p to 3p. We will never be warranted in suspecting that she has an adaptive preference, precisely because she's so stubborn she'll never change her preferences. Now, Cull might respond to this sort of critique by saying, look, the difference between 3p and 3 is, 1 which was a mistake. Let's just change 3p into being 3, right? The relevant part of the definition becomes the relevant part of the diagnostic tool. However, here I think there's a further worry that we can push, and that is that 3 is really risky. What grounds do we have for thinking that 3 is met for any given preference? Remember that 3 is that we do not think a person would have formed that preference under conditions conducive to basic flourishing. Now here, the development practitioner is being asked to make a counterfactual judgment about a person's preference formation that under conditions that neither the development practitioner nor the agent in question are in. Intervention is a really serious business. It can, in its extreme form, involve military action and the upturning of ways of life. Imputatively liberal versions of intervention seem to be extremely disruptive. So I worry that the standards of justification here are going to be too high for any practitioner's counterfactual judgment to meet. Furthermore, there's an additional question that we might ask for Cull. Is it a good account of what's going on empirically in sex selection? So here's the question. What explains the fall in sex selection that began to occur in around 2005, 2006? Now, as far as I can tell, and you'll just have to take my word for this, there doesn't seem to be any good explanation in terms of legislative change or change in enforcement. So here's a question. Could we explain it in terms of changes in preferences? Now, Cull could say something like the following. Women were flourishing more towards 2005, 2006 than before, and so were less likely to form adaptive preferences for sex selection. More women are in contexts that are more conducive to basic flourishing, and hence are developing preferences that are not inappropriately adaptive. However, I want to suggest that in many plausible indicators for basic flourishing, the UK actually saw a fall over the relevant period. The rate of increase in wealth inequality wouldn't peak until 2009, 2010. And meanwhile, food poverty would remain high and housing deprivation, child poverty, and household precarity rose over the period in question. The Cuderian, therefore, isn't going to be able to explain the fall of sex-selective preferences in terms of increases in basic flourishing, because there wasn't an increase in basic flourishing over the period. So I want to suggest an alternative account, and the alternative account I want to push is one that draws heavily on the work of Uma Narayan. Now, Uma Narayan is famous for putting the point that women are not dupes of patriarchy, but rather should be treated as rational agents bargaining with patriarchy. And I want to, follow that line of thought through. So here's the sort of Narayanian account. People weigh up various options available to them under systems of oppression and compare reasons for and against different options and make choices in the light of that reason. Importantly, structures of oppression shape the normative landscape, and we make choices in the light of this fact. Okay. So this is a kind of broadly decision theoretic kind of model of what's going on in reasoning, with the recognition that there are structures of oppression going on in the background. The thought is on this account that generally the issue isn't that we've had the wool pulled over our eyes as to what we should really value. The issue is that the world has been shaped by ideologies that constrain choice and assign values to various options in ways that are often oppressive and restrictive. Quick note on the term rational here. I mean it not in the narrow sense of a mechanical rational actor who efficiently maximizes expected utility, but rather in a broad sense of an agent being responsive to reasons in ways that are apt to the moral, pragmatic, aesthetic, and otherwise normative landscape that they find themselves in. And I want to suggest that this allows for idiosyncratic and sometimes non-optimal responses to that landscape, still counting as rational. Okay, so that's what I mean by rational on the account. What do I mean by bargaining with structures of oppression? Well, I mean negotiation of choices between bundles of goods and costs. This is partly because structural conditions often mean that goods rarely come alone. I often also mean difficult choices between goods. Opting for one good may foreclose the possibility of accessing some other good. I also mean attempting to push one's luck, violating the restrictions of a given oppressive structure in such a way that increases one's access to goods, whilst hoping to avoid the costs of doing so. All of these, I want to say, are kind of examples of bargaining with oppressive structures. Now, there are, I think, some general considerations in favor of this sort of account. Firstly, it's a uniform account of the structure of agents. Everyone is bargaining with oppressive systems and doing so in a broadly rational way. It's just that some people are in a better position than others, right? It's also less patronizing than other accounts. It does not claim that, say, non-Western women are particularly irrational or deceived in the way that some accounts do. And this is kind of falls out quite nicely from the uniform account of the structure of agency. I also think we have a really nice approach to sex selection. So the Narayan approach is to say people decide whether to engage in sex selection against backgrounds of oppressive structures. These backgrounds sometimes offer sets of choices that make opting to sex select attractive, and recognize that this people make a rational choice to opt for sex selection. So here's a sort of toy example. A woman is being pressured by her family into providing a male heir to inherit the family business in a context where the role of women is not to take on leadership roles. In such a case, the woman's choice to select for a boy reflects both the high social value of having a boy in that context and the lower social value of having a girl. So having no socially acceptable future leader for the family business is going to be something with economic problem, which gives us economic problems, and it will also mean the disapproval of one's family. So here's another example. A family has limited economic means, one girl, and exists in a patriarchal society that has, for various ideological apparatuses, inculcated the idea of the perfect family as one that has children of so-called both genders. Now, there will be, in such a society, social and psychological costs to mothers who do not achieve such a family. And so here, the choice to sex select for a boy reflects a reasonable response to the desire to have a putatively perfect family in a way that does not take on the economic costs of children beyond the second. And of course, the fact that one already has a girl. Moreover, Keda also has improved explanatory resources. Narayan has improved explanatory resources over Keda. So remember that in order to explain the fall in sex selection, Keda really only had one resource to appeal to, and that was a change in the level of flourishing. I think that Narayan has a couple of different resources that she can appeal to in explaining the fall in sex selection. The first is a change in the perceived value of the options available, and the second is a change in the bargaining position of people under these oppressive systems. Now, for one thing, I don't think that a change in bargaining position is going to explain the fall in sex selection, precisely for the same sorts of factors that were raised in objection to the Kederian explanation of the fall in sex selection. Inequality, impoverishment, and precarity do not make for a strong bargaining position against patriarchy. However, I think that we can explain the fall in sex selection via a change in the perceived value of the options available. So instead of pointing to actual material gains for those women, this sort of approach looks to perceptions and beliefs about the position of women and the roles that they might be expected to go on to fill. So here we can point to improvements in the perceived ideological and economic value of women, i.e. how women are valued in culture and how likely people think it is that a girl is going to have good economic power. So the last 30 years have seen a number of broadly liberal feminist ideas become entrenched via media, equality law, workplace practices, and social norms. And the idea that women can take on a number of social roles, including leadership roles, and the recognition that women can be independent earners is entirely mainstream, if not hegemonic at this point. Now, of course, so-called girl boss feminism has really been taken to task for its failure to do justice to the material needs of women, and the actual failure of it to actually get working class women into positions of power. But nonetheless, as an ideological, symbolic victory, it's won many. So this sort of explanation also allows us to point to a perceived increased social and ethical costs of sex selection, causing a fall in the phenomenon. So I want to point to various consultations that raise sex selection as an ethically fraught topic in the public imagination. And just at the time that sex selection rates in the UK began to fall, we saw two very public consultations raising it as an issue of moral import. Okay, so by way of conclusion, we saw that the preeminent account of adaptive preferences from Cull suffers internal issues and struggles to explain recent empirical data. And we also saw that the Narayanian account of adaptive preferences is generally attractive and has greater explanatory resources for explaining changes in preferences. Thanks for listening.